Chicago, 1,934, and a demolition crew is standing in front of a wall that shouldn't exist. Every other structure from the 1,893 World's Columbian Exposition has already been cataloged, photographed, attributed, and raised, each one logged under a named architect, a named firm, a named patron. This wall has none of those things. The federal demolition permit lists its composition as legacy concrete, a classification that, in the official record of that era, means nothing specific at all. But the crew's foreman, according to a note filed with the site supervisor and later folded into a miscellaneous works department folder, observed something he could not explain. Channels running through the interior of the wall, branching in a pattern that suggested deliberate ventilation design, with no visible intake from the exterior. The room behind that wall was cooler than it should have been. No mechanical source, no pipe connection, no external air exchange of any detectable kind. No engineer on the demolition site could account for it. The wall was removed anyway. The permit was filed. The folder was closed. And somewhere in the official record of one of the most documented architectural events in American history, the name of the person who built that wall is simply absent, not redacted, not damaged. Absent as though the question of authorship was never asked, which is itself a strange thing, because every other structure at that exposition had a designer whose name was attached to the project before the first foundation stone was laid. That single absence, in a record otherwise obsessive about attribution, is the first signal that something deliberate happened here. That absence is where this story begins. To understand why it disappeared, you have to go back to a world where the men who built it were already being erased. In Fresno, California, in 1968, a retired schoolteacher walked into the office of a local historian named Gerald Hawks and placed on his desk a document. 14 pages, single-spaced, typed on paper that had begun to yellow at the edges. The schoolteacher was the son of Alexi Morrosof, a civil engineer who had died in Fresno County in March of 1931. The document described what Alexei told his son the night before they came to the house. What it contained was not a political confession. It was not a manifesto. It was not a lament. It was a building method, precise, methodical, and written in the language of a man who had spent his life thinking in materials and loads and the slow seasonal physics of stone. Layered mineral composite, applied in thermal responsive sections that expanded and contracted with temperature change, self-sealing hairline fractures without external repair, requiring no mortar, no standardized components, no factory-produced inputs of any kind. The son's account of his father's testimony is precise in its technical language and almost clinical in its emotional restraint, which is itself a kind of evidence, because people who invent things for the purposes of mythology tend to make them dramatic. This document reads like a man trying to preserve something before it was lost, because he already knew it was being lost. Hawks recognized enough of its significance to deposit the document formally at the Fresno County Historical Society. By 1971, it had been recatalogued as a personal memoir, non-technical, and removed from the Engineering Archive Index entirely. No record survives of who made that recataloguing decision, who authorized it, or what criteria were applied. It was simply moved from the category of knowledge to the category of sentiment, which is one of the quieter ways that knowledge disappears. Hawks, fortunately, had made one extra copy before the deposit. That copy is what this investigation follows. To understand what Alexi Morrosof was describing, you have to understand where he came from, and you have to understand the world that shaped the knowledge he carried. Born in 1,871 inches Samara Oblast, in the fading administrative decades of the Russian Empire, he trained under a builder named Fyodor Chesnikov beginning in 1889. Chesnikov was not an architect in the credentialed Western sense. He belonged to a tradition of regional guild networks operating across the Volga Basin, not state-sanctioned, not formally registered with any imperial authority, not traceable through any licensing body, producing civic structures and water routing systems, and granary complexes that appear in the local Zemstvo ledgers of the 1,000 890 seconds listed as completed, functional, and officially approved, without a single named designer attached to any of them. The Zemstvo ledgers are real documents. They are not missing. They sit in regional archives and they describe in the dry administrative language of late imperial Russian local government buildings of considerable structural complexity, load-bearing spans, calibrated for heavy grain storage, integrated drainage channels, community granaries sized for populations in the hundreds of families with the architect column simply blank across hundreds of consecutive entries. Historians of the region have noted this anomaly and, in most cases, moved on. The deeper question: who designed these structures? Through what mechanism was the knowledge transmitted? And how was it calibrated to the specific soil density and seasonal frost depth of each individual site has not been answered by any published study. The system used physical measuring rods, each one encoded with proportional memory, passed from master to apprentice over years of direct physical training. Each rod was calibrated to the specific mineral geology of the region where it was produced, which meant the knowledge embedded in it could not be extracted and written down in universal terms. It was site-specific by design, not as a limitation, but as a precision instrument. The rod for the Samara lowlands would produce different wall thicknesses than a rod made for the higher altitude mineral fields to the east, because the soil behaved differently, the freeze depth was different, the mineral sources available for the composite were different. The system worked because it was local. It failed to survive the 20th century because the 20th century decided that local was a liability and universal was the only acceptable standard. By the 1,880 seconds and continuing through the first decade of the 1900s, this tradition had traveled through the vast and disorganized flows of Eastern European emigration into the construction trades of Chicago, St. Louis, and San Francisco. A woman named Yevgenia Sorokina, documented in American immigration records around 1901, was listed on entry as a builder's wife. Later, Chicago construction inspection records list her as a project interpreter at permit review meetings for structures in several immigrant neighborhoods. The pattern suggests something more than language translation. Her name appears on records for at least 3 buildings approved despite having no listed construction material, a notation that appears in Chicago permit records from 1901 through at least 1915 as material. Unlisted. Those buildings were not rejected. They were approved. They were occupied. They stood. The composite material was mixed on-site from local mineral sources, and it varied in chemical composition from one structure to the next, not because the builders lacked consistency, but because consistency to the specific site was the entire point. No two structures were chemically identical. No two sites were geologically identical. The system was resistant to industrial standardization, not by accident, but by its own internal logic. It could not be standardized because standardization would have destroyed what made it work. Someone in the Chicago permit office knew these buildings were being approved with unlisted materials across multiple ward districts over more than a decade. The question the permit record cannot answer is whether that person was protecting the builders or watching them, waiting for the moment when watching would become useful. Then comes 1893 and the world's Columbian Exposition and the anomaly that doesn't fit. More than 200 temporary structures were built for the Exposition across the fairgrounds. Most were demolished cleanly after the event closed, their materials cataloged, their designers credited, their demolition loads recorded within expected parameters. But at least 6 structures in the agricultural and engineering pavilion zones resisted standard demolition loads in ways that post-fair structural surveys noted as irregular, not dramatically, not in a way that stopped the demolition, but enough for an engineer surveyor to file a minority report. That report noted that 3 of these structures had wall joints showing no visible mortar at the seams, the material appearing fused rather than bonded, unlike anything in the standard construction vocabulary of the period. The minority report described something that did not fit the available categories. It was not included in the final Exposition engineering retrospective, published in 1896. The official record of that event, one of the most thoroughly documented architectural and engineering spectacles of the 19th century, simply does not contain it. The editorial decision to exclude it was made by someone. That person's reasoning is not recorded anywhere in the retrospective's editorial correspondence, which itself has been partially preserved and examined by historians of the Exposition. The exclusion was not an accident of incomplete record-keeping. It was a choice. And the same fused joint anomaly appears in a building survey from Street Louis in 1904, filed 2 weeks before that survey office closed permanently, which is the kind of timing that, when you encounter it repeatedly across different cities and different decades, begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern with a logic. At the federal level, the evidence was already being observed and cataloged. In Washington, the Bureau of Standards was consolidating its authority over American construction materials between 1901 and 1915, and Portland cement was in the process of becoming the mandated baseline, not because it demonstrated superior thermal performance, not because it showed better resistance to seismic stress, not because it outlasted other available materials under long-term load, but because it could be manufactured uniformly, shipped uniformly, inspected uniformly, and taxed uniformly. Uniformity was the criterion. Performance was secondary. Around 1909, the Bureau commissioned a survey of non-standard construction materials in active use among immigrant labor populations across American cities. The survey was completed. Its full classification and current archival status require verification against pre-1920 Internal Bureau reports. But the language attributed to it in subsequent internal correspondence is specific enough to deserve careful attention. It describes a material identified as a thermally adaptive aggregate of uncertain origin, documented in active use across at least 12 American cities, and characterizes it as potentially hazardous to standardization goals. Read that phrase slowly. Potentially hazardous to standardization goals. Not hazardous to the people living inside the buildings. Not hazardous to the structural integrity of the neighborhoods where it was used. Hazardous to the administrative goal of making all American construction legible to a single, centrally controlled bureaucratic standard. That phrase is the entire story compressed into 5 words. They didn't describe it as dangerous because they failed to understand it. They described it as dangerous because they understood it with complete precision, and they understood that it could not be made to fit the system they were building. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake produced evidence that should have been impossible to ignore, and so the relevant institution ignored it through a mechanism more elegant than suppression. It simply declined to follow up. In the south of Market District, where a substantial population of Eastern European immigrants had settled and built over the preceding decade, several structures survived the earthquake with minimal damage, while surrounding Portland cement buildings collapsed or cracked catastrophically. A relief coordinator's field report filed with the Army Corps of Engineers in the weeks following the disaster noted that certain structures of unknown material composition had shown unexpected structural integrity under seismic loading. The report was forwarded up the chain. The Army Corps response, recorded in the administrative log, was 4 words. Noted, no further action required. The surviving structures included a granary, a meeting hall, and 2 residential buildings, all constructed between 1898 and 1903, all listed in San Francisco city records with the notation material unlisted. No engineer was dispatched to analyze their composition. No material scientist was asked to explain why they had outperformed certified construction under the precise conditions: lateral seismic force, differential settlement, post-shock thermal cycling that building codes claimed to be optimizing for. No further action was required, and no further action was taken, and the question of why these specific buildings survived was officially closed before it was officially opened. By 1916, the Portland Cement Association had been formally founded, and its correspondence with the Bureau of Standards correspondence that exists in archival form and has been cited in partial form by historians of the American construction industry references the goal of eliminating non-certified construction practices in labor immigrant communities, not non-certified practices in general, in immigrant communities specifically, That specificity is important. The Morozov system required no factory supply chain. Every material input was sourced locally. It left no purchase records, no taxable supply line, no inspection dependency, no paper trail that a licensing body could follow or a tax authority could assess. It was economically invisible, which meant it was a direct threat to an industry whose entire economic model depended on the premise that building materials must be purchased from a certified manufacturer, inspected by a certified inspector, and approved under a code maintained by a body with financial relationships to both. By 1918, it was no longer a question of whether this system would be regulated. The only remaining question was sequence: who would move first and which legal instrument they would reach for. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 restricted Eastern European immigration to a fraction of its pre-war volume. In the same legislative period, 14 states adopted new building codes requiring licensed, certified materials as a condition of any occupancy approval. The legal architecture was precise in its indirection. No statute named the Morozov system. No code said that mineral composite construction was prohibited. The regulations simply required certification, and certification was administered by a body that had already determined which materials were eligible for consideration. Alexi Morrosof was 50 years old in 1921, living and working in Fresno, California, where he had operated a small construction business for more than a decade. A county inspector condemned a building he had constructed using his method. The structure was subsequently demolished without independent structural analysis, without any engineer unaffiliated with the county office examining the building before it came down. But the most consequential event was smaller and legally stranger than a demolition. Morozov's measuring rods, the physical instruments in which the system's proportional knowledge was encoded, the objects without which the formula could not be accurately reproduced, were confiscated under California Weights and Measures Law in 1922. They were classified not as construction equipment, not as building materials, but as uncertified measurement instruments, Weights and Measures Law. The legal distinction was not incidental. A building code violation could be appealed through engineering review, where the actual structural performance of a building might be introduced as evidence in the builder's defense. A weights and measures violation was administrative and final, subject to no engineering review, closed to any argument about whether the structures produced by those instruments were sound. The rods were confiscated. They were never returned. And without the rods, the proportional memory of the system calibrated over decades to specific soil densities, specific frost depths, specific mineral sources in specific geographies could not be transmitted with the precision to the method required. The system could still be described in words. It could not, without the rods, be reliably taught. Between 1922 and 1928, across California, Illinois, and Ohio, a pattern assembled itself in condemnation records and administrative filings. 23 buildings using unlisted composite materials were condemned, demolished, or formally reclassified as substandard construction. A Chicago building inspector filed an internal complaint in 1925, stating that several of the condemned structures showed no structural deficiency by any standard engineering measurement he had applied. That complaint was filed not under engineering records, but under personnel disputes, a classification that removed it from any technical review pathway and ensured it would not be seen by anyone conducting a materials study or a structural audit. The condemned buildings shared something beyond their composition. Every one of them was community-owned, rather than individually held. Under the property and legal frameworks of the period, a community-owned building had no single owner with legal standing to contest a condemnation order in civil court. Each structure could be removed without triggering litigation. The pattern suggests that the ownership structure was not an incidental commonality. It may have been the specific legal vulnerability that was identified and deliberately targeted. It wasn't the buildings they were dismantling. It was the network, the web of community ownership and shared knowledge that allowed the system to function without institutional support. The final mechanism of erasure was the quietest and the most structurally complete. Between 1928 and 1931, federal housing agencies engaged in standardizing mortgage eligibility began requiring that construction materials carry certification documentation as a condition of loan approval. Buildings constructed with uncertified materials became unmortgageable. They could still be physically occupied, but they could not be financed through any standard banking instrument, sold with normal title transfer, or passed through inheritance without complication. They became stranded assets present in physical reality, absent in economic legibility. Morosof's final client in Fresno lost financing on a planned granary in 1929 when a bank received federal guidance excluding non-certified aggregate construction from loan eligibility. The exclusion named nothing. It simply listed which materials were certified and left everything else in an unmarked, unappealing silence. You cannot appeal an absence. That, it turns out, was the precise engineering of the erasure, not a law that prohibited, but a list that omitted. The system ceased to exist on paper before it ceased to exist in stone, and the paper is what the economy reads. Alexi Morrosof died in March of 1931. The night before they came to the house, whatever authority that phrase describes, whatever agency arrived at that Fresno door in the final months of a broken man's final year, he spoke. His son listened and, eventually, wrote it down across 14 single-space pages that sat in a historical archive for 3 years before being reclassified as sentiment. Then came 1991 and the opening of post-Soviet regional archives, and a discovery that the official record on 2 continents had quietly agreed to leave unexamined. 14 Zemstvo-era buildings in the Samara region were still standing, still occupied, still in daily functional use after nearly a century of continuous habitation. The local preservation office had registered them in the Regional Heritage Registry as historic brick structures. They contained no brick. A structural engineer named Natalia Vershkova published a paper around 1,994 inches, a Russian-language engineering journal whose current archival location and citation status require verification, noting that the material composition of these buildings matched no known historic brick formulation, that independent visual and physical examination confirmed the absence of any brick or brick-adjacent material, and that the load-bearing walls showed 0 recorded maintenance interventions over 90 to 100 years of continuous occupation. 0. No repairs, no reinforcement, no recorded intervention of any structural kind across an entire century. No engineering explanation for this performance existed in any local technical record she could locate. Vershkova brought these findings to her institute director. She was told the buildings were already classified and that no further analysis was permitted. Her paper has not been cited in any subsequent literature accessible through available academic databases. The classification has not been corrected. The buildings remain listed as brick. They remain standing. And here is where 2 sides of an ocean, separated by a collapsed ideology and half a century of mutual institutional silence, produce the same result at the same time. In the United States, the Morozov system was erased through administrative omission, no certification, no mortgage eligibility, no legal standing. In Russia, the physical evidence of that same system was mislabeled in a heritage registry and placed beyond further study. In neither country was the material analyzed. In neither country did any institution ask why structures built without mortar, without standardized components, without a single factory-produced input, had outlasted the century that tried to replace them with something more manageable. At the Fresno County Historical Society, the original Morozov document was recatalogued as non-technical in 1971. By 1989, the same archive listed it as water-damaged and content unrecoverable. No destruction record accompanies that notation. No date of damage, no description of the event, no witness account of the physical deterioration. Gerald Hawkes died in 1983. His estate donated materials to the Historical Society in the years that followed, and probate records from 1983 through 1985 may contain reference to the second copy he made before the original deposit. That second copy, if it still exists, has not been publicly identified or examined. Its final pages, according to the son's description to Hawkes during their original meeting, included a partial material formula incomplete, but specific enough that a materials scientist familiar with mineral composite chemistry could identify the compound family and reconstruct the general system logic. No materials scientist, to any available public record, has seen it. The absence surrounding this system is not a passive thing. Passive absences form through neglect, through the slow entropy of underfunded archives and overworked catalogers and the ordinary attrition of time. This absence required maintenance. It required a recataloguing decision in 1971. It required a water damage notation without a destruction record in 1989. It required a weights and measures classification applied to wooden measuring rods in 1922. It required a minority report excluded from an engineering retrospective in 1896. It required 4 words, "No further action required," written in response to earthquake survival data in 1906. It required a personnel dispute classification applied to an engineering complaint in 1925. It required a heritage registry entry in Samara that says brick when the buildings say otherwise. Each of these is a discrete administrative act, deniable in isolation, unremarkable in its own context. Together, they describe something that functions like coordination, not necessarily conspiratorial coordination, not necessarily conscious in every instance, but a systemic pressure that consistently produced the same result. The knowledge was moved away from where it could be found, and the structures were labeled as something other than what they were, and the people who noticed were reclassified as having noticed the wrong thing. The system's final and most devastating irony is structural. It was designed, from its origin in the Volga Basin guilds, to require no institution, no factory, no supply chain, no central authority in order to survive and function. It needed only one person to teach one other person a rod passing between hands, a proportion demonstrated in the field, a formula embedded in the physical calibration of a specific instrument made for a specific ground. That was what was destroyed, not the buildings. Some of those are still standing, still load-bearing, still requiring no maintenance, still listed under the wrong material in the wrong registry category. Not the idea Hawkes's second copy may still exist in a probate box somewhere in Fresno County. What was destroyed was the transmission itself. The living chain of embodied, site-specific, person-to-person knowledge that could not be written down in universal terms because it was never designed to be universal. It was designed to be local. Exactly local. Fitted precisely to the ground it stood on, the minerals beneath that ground, the frost depth of that specific latitude, the seasonal temperature range of that particular river valley. The moment the rods were confiscated, the chain broke, not metaphorically, physically. The measurement instrument that carried the formula was gone, and without it, the formula could be described, but not reliably reproduced, which is the difference between knowing a thing and being able to do it. Somewhere in a probate archive in Fresno, or in a misclassified journal volume in a Russian regional library, or in the unremarkable daily solidity of 14 buildings in Samara that have stood without maintenance for more than a century, while the institutions around them changed governments, changed languages, and changed the names on their registry entries, the edge of something much larger is still faintly visible. The buildings are standing. The document may exist. The classification has never been corrected. And no institution, in any country, has answered the question of why structures built outside every certified standard of the 20th century continued to perform better than the century's certified standards required. Alexi Morrosof died in 1931. What he told his son that night was not a secret about buildings. It was a secret about what gets to last and who decides.